Hey there, this is Dane from featherprop.com. Thanks for joining me here. A few years back, I did sort of a fun exercise with the Bible. I went through all of Paul's 13 letters in the New Testament, and using whatever evidence I could find in them, I tried to place them in chronological order. I didn't read any commentators or consult a Bible encyclopedia. I just sort of focused on the internal evidence. The only non-biblical source that I used was the map that was found in the back of my Bible, and just kind of used it for reference. So let me start by saying that I began also with a couple of assumptions. First, there's a pretty strong tradition that Paul eventually makes it to Spain. And I worked with that assumption that he was eventually released from his imprisonment, where we find him in the closing book of Acts, and that he eventually continued on his journeys. Second, I assumed that he was later jailed and then eventually executed. So in today's video, I want to share with you the order that I placed Paul's 13 letters, and I'll explain to you why I did so. All right, let's begin with what I believe to be the oldest, number one, Galatians. Now, Paul wrote this letter to address the false teaching that Gentile Christians should be circumcised and then keep the Jewish law. In this letter, Paul labored very hard to prove that he was not a second-generation apostle, and he tried to show that he was commissioned by Jesus himself. Now, I'm aware that there is a dispute among scholars as to whether Paul was writing to the Galatians or the Gauls of northern Galatia, or to the Roman province of southern Galatia. If it's to the northern Galatians, then this letter has to have been written much later, because we have no record of Paul ever going into the area known as the Gauls. However, I believe the internal evidence of the letter heavily favors an earlier writing, and I believe it is the oldest surviving letter of Paul. Let me explain what I mean. In order to prove his apostleship, Paul described his first trip to Jerusalem in Galatians 1:8, which nicely parallels the first trip as described by Luke in Acts 9. He then tells the Galatians about a second trip to Jerusalem, which could easily fit into what Luke also described, which is in Acts 11. But what about Paul's next trip to Jerusalem as described by Luke in Acts 15? Well, if Galatians is a later letter, then Paul would almost certainly have included a description of that third trip, which is described in Acts 15, because that trip was for the very purpose of deciding if circumcision was necessary, which is why he's writing this letter to the Galatians in the first place. If he's trying to demonstrate to the Christians in Galatia that they don't have to be circumcised, then why not reiterate the unanimous decision reached by all of the apostles on the subject? Why not share the letter that they have dispatched to everyone after that ecumenical council? I believe that the obvious answer to those questions is that the Jerusalem Council had not yet been held. To me, this is pretty strong evidence that the letter to Galatians had to have been written before Paul's third trip to Jerusalem, as described by Luke in Acts 15. I think that the writing of this letter most likely occurred in Antioch during the time period described in Acts 14:28. The next book, I believe, is what we call 1 Thessalonians. We read about the church in Thessalonica's founding in Acts chapter 17. So, of course, the epistle could not have been written before the timeline of that chapter. In 1 Thessalonians 3, Paul indicated that he was waiting in Athens for Timothy. Then in verse 6, Paul announced that now Timothy had returned. In Acts chapter 17, we find the account of Timothy and Silas remaining in Thessalonica while Paul goes to Athens to wait for them. By comparing 1 Thessalonians and Acts, it would appear that Paul wrote the letter in Athens just after Timothy and Silas caught up to him. I believe that this letter was written during the time frame found in Acts 17, verses 14 through 16, making it the second Pauline epistle. Number 3, 2 Thessalonians. There isn't much internal data in this letter indicating when it could have been written. I place it very close to the 1 Thessalonians letter for one simple reason. They're the only two letters in the New Testament collectively written by Paul, Timothy, and Silvanus. The number of Paul's traveling companions would wax and wane from time to time. People could come and go. However, the three of them must have been together long enough for these two letters to have been penned. Number 4, 1 Corinthians. There's little doubt in my mind for the timeline of this letter. Paul tells the church in Corinth that he had sent Timothy to them, and that at the moment of the writing, he was in Ephesus. He also added that he would be passing through Macedonia. This timeline is perfectly matched in Acts 19:22, where Paul remained in Ephesus but sent Timothy and Erastus into Macedonia, where Corinth is found. Therefore, I believe Paul wrote this letter sometime during the time described in Acts chapter 19. Number 5, Romans. In this letter, Paul mentions two things that help me place this book's next in our list. One, two of the people whom Paul lists as being with him are Timothy and Gaius. And number 2, Paul mentions that he's on his way to Jerusalem with an offering. Since Paul also told the Corinthians about an offering, it would seem reasonable that he wrote to the Romans and the Corinthians during the same missionary journey, probably found somewhere between Acts 18:23 and Acts 21, verse 17. But we have something that could narrow this time frame down even further. In Acts 20, verse 4, a group of people reached Paul, two of them being Timothy and Gaius. As already explained, these two were with Paul when he wrote the letter. Therefore, the writing of Romans almost has to have taken place during the time frame that we find in Acts 20, verses 1 through 4. Number 6, 2 Corinthians. Paul mentions in this letter that he has already visited them twice. Since his second visit to that church, recorded in Acts 20, verses 1 through 4, 2 Corinthians had to have been written sometime after the time frame of Acts chapter 20. Now, I think it's important to note that Paul doesn't mention that he's a prisoner in this letter. Therefore, it was either written before the first arrest or after the first, but before the second. And I believe that it's likely this latter time frame, since Paul speaks as if he's already on his way to Corinth for a third visit, and we have no record of that taking place in the book of Acts. Another reason to place this letter beyond the memory of Acts is that in 2 Corinthians 11, Paul describes some really bad things that occurred to him. In that list, he describes suffering shipwreck 3 times. We have only one account of this happening, which is in Acts 27:41. Although it is entirely possible that he suffered shipwreck on other occasions that Luke didn't mention, one must ask why it was important enough for Paul to mention, but not for Luke. Therefore, this book must have been written after the book of Acts was already completed. Number 7, 1 Timothy. Now, most chronological lists don't see this letter as early as I do. I suspect that it was written after the book of Acts was closed, but before Paul's second imprisonment, since he makes no mention of being in chains in this letter. He also seems to suggest that he and Timothy parted by choice, and that Paul is expecting to visit Timothy very soon. Now, this would indicate to me that Paul is a free man, able to make his own choices about where he wants to go and the things that he wants to do. Now, unlike Paul's second letter to Timothy, where he needs Timothy to come immediately to his assistance, here Paul desires that Timothy remain in Ephesus. There's no urgency in Paul's voice, leaving me with the impression that it's an earlier letter, not a later one. Number 8, Titus. Titus is in Crete when Paul writes this letter. We know that Paul made a stop on that island while en route to Rome, as described in Acts 27 and 8, but it's doubtful that he left Titus behind since he was being transported as a prisoner and may not have had really the freedom to make those kinds of decisions. It's more likely, in my thinking, that Paul returned sometime after being released in Rome. Again, Paul doesn't mention being in chains, which I believe places this letter after the first arrest, but before the second. Now, one thing to note in this letter, Paul apparently doesn't know whether to send Artemas or Tychicus to Titus. Remember that, because it will come into play in our next letter. Number 9, Colossians. These next 3 letters are very difficult for me to place in any kind of order. Paul now appears to be in prison. Timothy is again with Paul. Paul mentions that he's sending Tychicus with Onesimus to the Colossians with a word of his situation. Remember, in Titus, Paul wasn't sure who he was going to send. Now it appears that question has been, that answer has been cleared up. He's sending Tychicus, not Artemas. Therefore, Paul must have written this letter after the one to Titus. Number 10, Ephesians. An internal date stamp in this book is really hard to find. Paul doesn't appear to be with Timothy. He again alludes to his plans of sending Tychicus to visit his readers. Therefore, this letter appears to have been very closely written to around Titus, Colossians, and Philemon, in the same time frame that those books were written. Number 11, Philemon. In this very brief letter, Paul is returning a runaway slave to his owner. Again, we don't have a lot of data to work with. The slave is Onesimus, who is already, we already know, is traveling with Tychicus from Colossians. Therefore, these last 4 letters seem to have been written within a very short span of time. This one could have been written before Ephesians. I just really am not sure about that. Number 12, Philippians. In this letter, Paul makes reference to not only being in prison, but in the custody of Caesar's guard. Therefore, it seems to have been written in Rome rather than in one of the many jails that he seems to allude to in his letter to or in 2 Corinthians. And it's not clear to me, however, if it's his first or second imprisonment. Paul seems optimistic of his imprisonment and seems to expect to be released because he tells his readers that he hopes to visit them very soon. Now, this would suggest it was the first imprisonment. However, it's also quite possible that it's the second imprisonment and that Paul initially is feeling optimistic about being released. The reason why I place it with the second imprisonment and make it sort of a later letter is because he uses a phrase that he uses in what appears to be his final letter. We haven't looked at it yet, and that is Timothy. And that phrase is being poured out as a drink offering. You can compare that to 2 Timothy 4, 6, and 7. Though Paul admits that he doesn't know what's going to happen to him, there is a finality in the sentiment of being poured out as a drink offering. And it's for that reason that I see this as a later letter, not an earlier one. Finally, number 13, 2 Timothy. In this letter, Paul tells Timothy that he sent Tychicus to Ephesus. That would clearly place this letter after Titus, Colossians, Ephesians, and Philemon, where he had promised that he was going to send Tychicus to them. Demas, who was with Paul when he wrote to the Colossians and to Philemon, has now deserted Paul, leaving him alone except for Luke. Paul asks that Timothy do his best to come quickly to Paul, hoping that he can arrive before winter sets in. Now, Paul tells Timothy that he's being poured out as a drink offering and that the time of his departure is at hand. He claims that he has fought the good fight and that he's finished the race. Now, the tone of this letter is much more solemn. It reads more like a farewell address than anything else. And for that reason, I place it last on my list. You know, I know some people wonder why the books in the New Testament are arranged in the order that we have them and not in a chronological order. You know, in our Western minds, that would make the most sense. However, there is a reason for the order, and it just makes a different kind of sense. You see, the books of the New Testament are grouped first by author and then by size. For example, after the 4 Gospels and the book of Acts, we have all of Paul's epistles grouped by size, from the largest, which is Romans, to the smallest, which is Philemon. I think there's some benefit in understanding the chronology of the New Testament and the letters and the order in which they were written, though it's not really an essential benefit. Putting these books in order without consulting any other source was just sort of a fun thing for me to try to do. And I think we can sometimes get a little lazy in our Bible reading because we rely on commentators and Bible scholars to do our thinking for us. It's good, I believe, just sit down with the Bible without someone else's notes and just read it. Let us speak to you without the filter of some commentator's thoughts. Now, I do appreciate scholars who have contributed much to our understanding of the Bible, but nothing can replace the simple joy of sitting down with the Bible and allowing the Spirit to lead our thoughts. Well, I hope this was helpful to you. If it was, then crash that thumbs up button. And while you're at it, why not subscribe to this channel? And don't forget to click the little notification bell so that you're alerted long before your friends are to a new video. Now, with that, I'll sign off, and I hope to see you here next time. Thanks for watching.